I'm going to turn it over to my Clery Center colleague, Sarah Barrett.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cheryl. And welcome everyone to our National Campus Safety Awareness Month webinar. Today we will be discussing intersectionality and its role in crime reporting and support. So I'm glad to have you all here with us today. First, we'll go ahead and give some introductions. My name is Sarah Barrett, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Director of Training and Education for Clery Center. I've been with Clery Center for just about 6 months now and am responsible for developing curriculum and training individuals participating in our Clery Act training seminars. I'm also the lead for National Campus Safety Awareness Month offering, so I hope you enjoy everything that we have for you this month. And prior to coming to Clery Center, I worked both in student services and as an administrator and have experience writing and implementing university policy and overseeing various compliance programs, including Clery Act requirements and compiling the annual security report each year. And with that, I will pass it off to my colleague, Laura, to introduce herself.
Hi there, everyone. Thanks so much, Sarah. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. I see folks typing in the group discussion pod, just double checking. Thank you again, Sarah, so much for the introduction, and welcome everyone to our first NACSAM webinar of 2020. We are so excited to bring you this content that Sarah has so intentionally developed this year, and we're really excited to just have a conversation with you all this afternoon. As Sarah said, I'm the Senior Director of Programs at Clery Center. I've been here for a little over 5 years now, and I have a background in school counseling, so worked as a school counselor in Philadelphia Public Schools before joining the higher education world in both residence life and student conduct roles at an institution in Philadelphia. So I am really looking forward to joining you all today as our conversation starts to tackle some higher level concepts and connected to our theme for NACSAM and also the state of affairs of the world that we're all living in today. So thank you so much, Sarah.
And before we jump in, we do want to take some time to acknowledge all of our NACSAM sponsors. So Code Blue is sponsoring today's webinar, so a big thank you to them. Code Blue is a safety industry leader known for their iconic blue light foam pedestal. So if you have those on your campus, you're probably familiar with Code Blue. And if you'd like to learn more about Code Blue, you can visit their website at www.codeblue.com for more information. And likewise, if you or your organization are interested in becoming a NACSAM or Clery Center sponsor, you can contact us at info@clerycenter.org with the subject line sponsorship. So as we move into our presentation, whether you've attended one of Clery Center's offerings before or not, we always want to take just a few moments at the beginning of each presentation to give a little bit of history related to our organization and the Clery Act itself. Our organization was founded by two parents, Connie and Howard Clery, after the brutal rape and murder of their daughter, Jeanne Clery, in her residence hall at the hands of another student. And after Jeanne's death, Connie and Howard asked a lot of questions. They asked, why did this happen? How did this happen? Is there something we could have done to prevent this? And after finding out that there had been a number of violent crimes in the years prior to Jeanne's arrival or prior to Jeanne's death even, that the community wasn't aware of, that prospective parents and students like Jeanne's family weren't aware of because there was no requirement, they really committed to working to create safer campus communities. And ultimately, their efforts resulted in the creation of a number of state and federal laws, most notably the Clery Act, which is the landmark federal law that requires colleges and universities to share information about their campus community regarding crimes occurring within and around campus, and then also to provide specific campus safety policy and procedure information. And so as part of their work, the Clery founded Security on Campus Incorporated, which was renamed in 2012 to honor the work of the Clerys. And so that's how we became known as Clery Center. And, you know, on a positive or on a personal note, I wanted to share that last night I had the opportunity to actually speak with Connie Clery, obviously virtual. We're in a virtual world these days. But it was so inspiring, and, you know, I think it's so important for us to center the conversation and to remember the spirit of the law, because sometimes, you know, in doing the day-to-day, we're so focused on the letter of the law, but also remembering that there are crime victims on campus and survivors of crime, and that really goes to the spirit of the law. And so, you know, I would just hope that as you are here with us today, and as you continue to do your work, that you remember the spirit of the law and how the Clerys were able to take, you know, what seemed like a tragedy and really turn it into a triumph. And as we think about what we do here at the Clery Center, our work is really grounded in assisting institutions with greater compliance and commitment to the Clery Act, and we're able to do that through a few key programs and actions. And so, first of all, that's related to education and training. So we have our comprehensive, we have our Clery Act training seminar, and we provide multiple different levels. So we have our comprehensive, our fundamentals, we have our online and now virtual. We're living in a virtual world, and then our custom. We engage in speaking engagements, and then also host various webinars. So we have a webinar coming up in October related to alerting. So please make sure to mark your calendars for that. And then we also participate in additional initiatives like National Campus Safety Awareness Month. So this month in our offerings, Kristen's Crusade, We Don't Haze, and then our OVW Campus Grant Program. And all of this is really centered around our membership program, wherein we're able to bring colleges and universities together to build a more customized and sustainable approach to campus safety as it relates to Clery Act compliance. And so essentially, institutions that are members have access to exclusive services like annual security reports, which I know can be very helpful, free and discounted training material, customized assessments, and also access to our extensive resource library. So if you're interested in learning more about what Clery Center membership offers and what that looks like, feel free to shoot us a message in the tech support area, and we can share a little bit more about that. And then also, as it relates to policy, we engage in policy work. Obviously, the Clery Act is a consumer protection law. And then we also engage in technical assistance. So, you know, for us, we endeavor to provide institutions with reliable information as you on campus are continuing the work of planning and developing your approach to Clery Act compliance. So we are more than happy to provide some of that technical assistance, whether by email or via phone, to really help you continue to do the work on campus each day. And as we think about our work, that was something that we took into consideration as we were thinking of really the theme of this year's NACSAM. I know many of you have participated in NACSAM year after year after year, and before you've probably seen us really hone in on maybe one specific theme or topic or crime related to the Clery Act. But this year we really wanted to acknowledge where we are in higher education and as a nation. And, you know, we really wanted to speak to something that would acknowledge that in the wake of COVID-19 and the advancing civil rights movement, institutions around the nation were reaffirming their commitments to campus safety. And in doing so, you know, our communities were wrestling with a new normal, but also recognizing that the Clery Act remains the same. It's a call to action. And so this September, Clery Center will highlight how the Clery Act can serve as a guidepost, centering conversations around personal and campus safety following these historic events of 2020. So whether that's examining the increase in reports of intimate partner violence during lockdown, or the uptick in hate crimes and bias-related incidents, the Clery Act can really serve as a barometer to examine not only our campus climate, but also what's going on outside of higher education. And we know that there is little doubt that 2020 will go down in history, and we wanted to offer a theme that captures that in a really applicable way. And so today, our goals for this webinar are related to discussing how the events of 2020 highlight the influence of intersectionality in higher education, review how overlapping identities might impact various aspects of Clery Act requirements, and individual experiences with crime, reporting, and support services, and then also share highlights from our new NACSAM resource, Viewing the Clery Act through an Intersectional Lens. And so to start things off, I know folks were able to utilize the chat box and to say their hellos, but we'd really like to hear from you all. It's been a little bit since we've offered our last webinar and have connected with some of you, and so we'd really like to hear, what does the same yet different look like for you? Knowing that we're doing the same work, many of us, but in a very different way, whether that be remote, whether that be with a hybrid learning model. You know, there's so many different ways in which our lives are the same and may feel the same, but you know, things are a little bit different. So if folks want to go ahead and navigate down to the chat box, I'd love to hear or to see some of the responses as you think about how that theme, our NACSAM theme this year, really applies to you, the same yet different. And I'll go ahead and give a couple moments there. I imagine that, you know, it's a little bit of a nuanced question, and so there's only so much that you can type, but would really like to hear from a couple folks to hear or to see what things look like for them. Okay, so it looks like our first answer here from Rob, more coordination needed via a more remote environment, but expected to meet the same requirements for Clery. Exactly, and that's exactly what we spoke to on the previous slide. You know, the same yet different, and the Clery Act is the same. We still have the same reporting requirements. You're still responsible for providing the information related to your policies and your procedures, and putting out your annual security report. There's so many different responsibilities that we still might hold while we're also trying to juggle, whether that be family life or a different way of life on campus. There's so many different elements or different challenges or ways in which we might interact with our environment that are different, but the work remains the same. We're still on campuses. We still have Clery Act requirements. We still are supporting our students and their endeavor to learn. And so, you know, for many of us, that has changed the way we have to really navigate this world of compliance. I know a lot of folks were typing there, and hopefully we'll continue to see those answers coming on through. But as we think about, you know, the same yet different, a lot of that came into play as our lives are starting to look different following, you know, March. And so it looks like we have some other answers here related to the same concerns, advocacy, a passion for our campus community, different Title IX implementation. Yes, Title IX came out. And, you know, someone said in the same campus with no students on the campus. And so really, as we were working to figure out what that new norm was, it looks like here someone said working just as hard as before, but the personal interaction is a challenge, getting everyone on the same page. We were virtual, and we were figuring out our new norm. And really how that came about was, you know, as we started to see back in March, all of these different news developments related to COVID-19 and information about hotspots and positive testing rates and overall infection rates. All of this information was dominating the news. But likewise, at the same time, we also began to see more information about the advancing civil rights movement. And, you know, eventually we saw that we had two different crises on our hands. We had a health crisis, And then we also had a cultural crisis. So as folks were starting to really think about how they could protect themselves health-wise, whether that be, during lockdowns or engaging in different safety implementation, with personal protective gear and masks and things like that, we had a very different world. And we also had heightened sensory responses because we were faced with this really invisible threat. There was a threat to our health and safety, but also for a lot of folks, there was a threat to their livelihood. And we know that many scholars have noted before, when humans are faced with threats, more often than not, adrenaline and stress hormones like cortisol kick in, and an acute stress response starts to unfold or surface. And what we know, what we know as maybe the fight or flight response starts to gear up and begins to prepare us for reaction in a survival mode, telling us to either run or to stand our ground and fight. And following the various acts of racially motivated bias incidences and violence, demonstrators across the country and around the world found themselves fighting and standing their ground, but for accountability, for equity, and for a new way forward. We know that, when we see this threat to health and to safety, this can be the catalyst for movements. And we've seen that in society now, and we've seen that before. This has happened time and time again. And, even today, thousands of academics around the U.S. are participating in a strike to promote racial justice on the first day of something called the Scholar Strike. And so as we think about kind of the culmination as for the health crisis and then our culture crisis, we got to this place where we had to really consider who was being impacted. And as we learned more about both the health crisis and our cultural crisis related to injustice, we started to hear how racial and economic disparities played a role in some of the occurrence, whether that be related to COVID-19 or the occurrence of racially motivated violence and systemic inequality. And more this concept of intersectionality started to show up in the mainstream lexicon as we recognize that an individual's identities influence the way that they show up and are perceived in the world. So as that relates to their gender expression, to their language, religion, their location, their nationality, their ethnicity, all of those different identities could impact not only their experience with the global health crisis, but then also as it relates to some of the systemic inequality. And intersectionality, the term, has almost become a buzzword, but we know it's so much more than that. It was actually offered as a theoretical metaphor in Kimberly Crenshaw's 1989 essay as a way to understand how multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage can converge in a way that impedes access to structures, to systems, or really even gets played out as marginalization or oppression in daily life and our social relationships. And since that time, since 1989, when Kimberly first kind of shared this metaphor, many theorists and researchers have expanded upon the concept to include new definitions and to use the term to include a variety of identities. And here we have a quote from Kimberly, and she says, "The way we imagine discrimination or disempowerment often is more complicated for people who are subject to multiple forms of exclusion. The good news is that intersectionality provides a way for us to see it." And that's so important. That's really our intention today as we gather to really look at how intersectionality plays a role in crime reporting and how we support victims of crime and what that looks like for us to have an intersectional lens in really implementing a lot of the Clery Act requirements on our campus in a day-to-day. And as we think about our campuses, we really have to acknowledge the history of where of the history of how we've gotten to where we are right now, and really thinking about how colleges came to be and institutions of higher learning. For the vast majority of higher education's existence, universities and college admissions were mostly reserved for white or privileged or the elite, and more than ever, now our campuses are becoming diverse, which is increasingly apparent in both our student population as well as our staff and faculty. And so we have to acknowledge where we started, but also where we are right now and where we hope to be. And, over the last 50 years, there's really been a dramatic shift in the composition of our campuses. And one reason for that is diversity can enrich the overall college experience. For many students, the arrival on campus is an introduction to various forms of diversity that they may not have ever had the opportunity to experience, whether that be in regards to race, gender, ethnicity, culture, sexual orientation, economic status, or even diversity of thought. And embracing and navigating the salad bowl of campus life. I like to say salad bowl rather than melting pot, because salad bowl, I think, is really more appropriate. We're not just melting into this amalgamation of blended identities. We are all separate and unique and distinct, and we can come together to complement each other and to build off one another for a better creation. And I think higher education has now started to recognize just how valuable diversity is and what that has looked like. And so as we continue to think about our colleges and our universities, knowing that diversity is important in intersectionality and the recognition of that, how can we consider how that might play a role in the work that we are doing? And so I just like to put this role out to folks right now to just openly and honestly share, have you ever considered how intersectionality might impact your Clery work? And so I'll give folks just a few minutes here. You have a couple different options. You can say, yeah, I've thought about this before, or, honestly, I haven't thought about this before. Or even if you're unsure, maybe you've thought about it in some ways and maybe you really haven't. Just feel free to go ahead and indicate that in the poll here, and then we will see where we landed and who we are as a group today. Okay, it looks like folks are still responding here. We'll go ahead and give it just a few moments and see. Sure, I think we can go ahead and close that poll then. And we can kind of broadcast and see where our results landed. So it looks like the majority of folks have considered how intersectionality might impact your Clery work. And then that's followed by pretty split between no and not really sure how intersectionality might impact your work with Clery. And so I definitely want to hear from the folks that say, yeah, I've thought about how intersectionality might impact my work, and these are the ways that I've done so, because we'll have some additional time later on in our webinar today to share and to speak to some of those experiences. And for the folks that indicated no, or maybe they were unsure, really walking through with us today as we discuss how having an intersectional lens might inform some of the work that you're doing on campus each day as it relates to Clery work. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it on over to Laura as she talks through our intersections of Clery and safety.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And always great to bring up the salad metaphor. So thanks so much for doing that for this group today. So yeah, as we move into this, the heart of the content of this webinar today, it's really going to be helpful for you all to have the chance to chat and share your thoughts with us as well. And so we're going to have a group discussion in a couple of slides about this concept. So make sure to prepare your thoughts for joining us in that way. But what we want to start with is a recognition that we had at Clery Center around how if you apply the framework of intersectionality to the Clery Act requirements, it forces you to reconsider the notion of safety and how safety truly is a relative concept depending on the own identities you hold and your own experiences moving through the world. So as you, as folks on campus that are responsible for internalizing and then turning around and implementing Clery Act requirements, it's really imperative for you all to consider and for your institutions to consider how intersectionality of identity may impact the experience that individuals have of the systems that you've put in place to comply with the Clery Act. So because the Clery Act is a consumer protection law, one of its goals is providing transparency between institutions of higher education and its consumers, so students, employees, staff, campus community members, and that transparency should be about not just Clery crime statistics, but campus policies and procedures that guide efforts to hopefully improve campus safety. So again, the goal of the Clery Act is promoting that transparency and accountability around safety or crime between campuses themselves and the students and employees and staff that use the campus or consume the campus's services. So as safety is a relative concept, the identities that you hold, the identities your campus community members hold, will influence the way they interpret and experience the Clery Act requirements. And so that will also inform whether or not their own measure of safety has been met. So as we all have different expectations for what is or what feels safe, and because our identities influence how we experience things like systems, structures, and social relationships, it helps to start with thinking through who are the most marginalized communities at our institution, and let's make sure our services serve and address their needs first, because the ripple effect outward from that means that all others that do not experience those pieces of marginalization or oppression will ultimately benefit. Because if those services or those systems or policies are in place to first address the most oppressed, then they will inherently address all folks. So we want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we walk through some aspects of the Clery Act and how we think intersectionality can address or influence the way you put these requirements in place at your own campus. So as we think through each of the areas of the Clery Act, so for us today we're going to talk through just a handful of pieces of Clery: crime reporting, ongoing disclosures, response procedures for dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, and then community education or prevention programming requirements that must take place because of the Clery Act. We want you to consider how identity may influence the associated processes, structures, or individuals involved in each of these areas. So let's talk through crime reporting first. So for most folks, law enforcement is a very polarizing subject right now, especially considering the climate of our country and the way that folks are viewing or interacting with law enforcement. Folks have very strong opinions on whether or not they are pro or against this system, this structure in our country, on our campuses. And so what we want to bring forth for all of you that are attending is a consideration that perhaps law enforcement is not feeling safe for all people. That's what we want you to think through and to think about, that the approaching law enforcement or seeking out law enforcement is not thought of as a positive or safe option for all people, depending on identities that those people might hold. And that could be people of color, that could be, in particular, Black people, that could be queer people or members of the LGBTQ community. That could be differently abled individuals. And it could be for a variety of reasons. It could be because they themselves have had negative interactions with law enforcement. It could be because when they've sought out law enforcement in the past, law enforcement has not supported them or believed them or helped them or made them feel heard or seen. And for all of those reasons, we want you to consider that as one of Clery's requirements is that campus security authorities ultimately share their information to a designated crime collection body, and how in many instances that could be law enforcement or campus public safety, that soon individuals might start to feel that reporting is not safe for them, even if it is to a trusted person like a CSA, because they know that ultimately they will receive outreach or they will have to respond to an entity that they do not inherently trust. And so because of that, we wanted you to think through also this idea of confidential reporting, which we think is one of the more limiting areas of Clery as it stands today. And that's really connected to the idea of how when you think about confidential reporting sources, right now, due to the 2016 handbook, victim advocates used to be a group that folks might consider to be confidential, depending on the laws within your own state. And I'm talking now specifically about sexual assault or dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking reports, so I apologize for this quick shift here. But when we think about confidential reporting, technically, under the Clery Act, it is not only connected to those 4 crimes, but we wanted to highlight an issue here where a thought to consider around how intersectionality comes up with crime reporting. So under Clery, the only individuals that are truly exempt from being CSAs because of the functions they provide are pastoral and professional counselors when functioning in that capacity. So pastoral and professional counselors in all other ways, if they were not exempt, would actually be considered CSAs because the function that they serve fits under one of the categories of being a CSA. But since they are exempt when functioning in that capacity, that means folks can reach out to those sources, share information with them, and that information is not automatically passed on to a designated crime collection body. The struggle with that, or the challenge with that, is that those 2 groups of people are, again, similarly not always thought of as comfortable or safe groups for many marginalized communities. For example, people of color, additionally LGBTQ folks or the queer community have not always thought of pastoral and professional counselors, pastoral I should say, and or professional counselors as being places that will hear or receive them well. Certainly so many aspects of queerness have been stigmatized and medicalized by mental health for a really long time as well. And so while we have evolved our thinking in some of those areas, those 2 groups are, again, kind of polarizing, pastoral and professional counselors. So Clery inadvertently limits options for certain people, depending on their identities, to access a safe place to report confidentially. Thirdly here, the concept of good faith reports. So prior to the 2016 handbook, this concept of a report being, quote, made in good faith was a factor that a CSA should be taking into consideration when they are passing information along to the designated crime collection body at their institution. But that phrase has since been removed from the explanation of responsibilities for CSAs because it can have a lot of intentional or unintentional bias or weight or conflict addressed in it when it starts to think through, you know, based on, it's such a subjective thing, right, to make an evaluation about something being reported in good faith. In whose good faith? And so it starts to, you know, talk about or raise the question of, does somebody's race, gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, or the type of crime they are reporting actually cause them to be considered to be reporting not in good faith? So due to some considerations like that this idea that, you know, in good faith is really maybe not something that we should be putting on the burden of a CSA, especially if all the factual information meets the definition of a Clery crime occurring within Clery geography, that we'll take those reports that are made. We basically, when I say we, I mean the Department of Education, I think wanted to start moving away from campuses making determinations around reports being counted or not because they determined that the report was not made in good faith. If you are looking through your 2016 handbook, you'll see that in relation to the daily crime log, this phrase is still written out and explained and used as a factor to consider when you are taking down information to include in that daily crime log. So the concept is not removed entirely, but it has been, disassociated from CSA reporting, which I think is helpful to note. So in each of these three areas, what we just want you to, again, start thinking about are how in this aspect of reporting under the Clery Act, when you apply the framework of intersectionality, so realizing that everyone's identities that they hold could cause opportunities for expansive thinking as well as opportunities for multiple layers of oppression to happen at the same time. When you think through these requirements in that way, you might start to want to think about what are ways in which we can circumvent or address these challenges. And we'll get to that in a few slides as well. One example here is, so I was kind of getting ahead of myself earlier when I was talking about victim advocates, but as pastoral and professional counselors are the only folks that are exempt from reporting, folks might feel like they are limited in who they could reach out to truly process something that has happened to them without it being automatically reported. In the past, the role of a victim advocate was always thought of as a role that could help out here, but as of the 2016 handbook, victim advocates are thought of as examples of CSAs according to the Department of Education. So what many folks have tried to do is bridge this understanding so that people can still seek out support from advocates in ensuring that advocates explain to their clients the limits of their responsibility, sharing that as a CSA, they do have to share non-identifiable information with the designated crime collection body at their institution, but that if advocates are telling their clients that information up front, that still might cause somebody to seek them out as an option as opposed to feeling like they have nowhere to go because they don't feel comfortable going to a pastoral or a professional counselor. So again, we just want to raise your own awareness around some of these areas of Clery that you might not have thought about before as being impacted by the concept of intersectionality. We also helpfully have a handout that re-summarizes some of these points that we've shared with you in that files pod as well, and we highlight it in a couple of slides also. So another area where this concept comes up is around ongoing disclosures, or in particular, I would say timely warning. Anecdotally, I would say folks are sharing that timely warnings contain suspect descriptions more often when the suspect appears to be a Black male as opposed to any other type of person. And so what we asked folks to start thinking through is, and honestly this is a guidance or a promising practice tip from a colleague at another institution that's a Clery coordinator, where they have decided internally that if the only information that they have about an individual or a suspect is their race and their sex, that they will not include that as a suspect description because for them that is not detailed enough and causes more confusion than relief because now you've caused an entire swath of folks to be, under suspicion when they don't necessarily have to be. And so again, you want to make sure that those that are in charge of determining whether or not to issue a timely warning or who are determining the content that goes within a timely warning, who is there to hold them accountable to make sure that their subjectivity doesn't overcome the concrete factors that are in place to make some of these determinations. So one tool that Clery Center has that we shared before is something called a timely warning decision matrix, where there are very black and white questions that you are, I should never say black and white. I guess I don't mean it to be that obvious or stark because there is a lot of ambiguity around a lot of requirements connected to campus safety and the Clery Act. what I mean to say is there are some concrete things that you can think through to make a possibly more objective than subjective determination for issuing an alert. So what we want you to, challenge your own staff or institution to think through is how much of your own, implicit bias, how much of your own challenges or biases are coming up when you are making a determination around whether or not something has the potential to be a serious or ongoing threat. That timely warning decision matrix that we have is one tool that you can use to use more objective factors to make that kind of analysis. But regardless, your own thoughts and opinions and experiences are going to influence the way you even evaluate that information. So what we recommend is trying to raise awareness around those types of thought patterns to hold each other accountable to make sure that you're following guidelines that are agreed upon, that are equitable for all people, so that the timely warnings themselves can hopefully serve the intention that they had when they were created of informing people that there is a potential for this crime to occur and that they have the opportunity to report it, and here are some prevention tips and information that they should use in order to make that kind of a decision about whether or not they need support or to report. It's also important for us to note today, so Sarah, Cheryl, and myself, that Clery Center does keep in mind and recognizes that the Clery Act as a whole is predicated on a belief that our current law enforcement systems, so things like reporting to police, using crime definitions from the FBI, are good things that help people. So it's our job, as well as all of your job, to examine that further. Who are these requirements good for? What are they good for? And if the answer is not everyone, something needs to change about either their inherent construction or their application. And so we, hold ourselves accountable to be asking these questions as well. And so another area we wanted to bring to your attention to just think through is the response procedures that are in place for dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And just think through, how do we share information about the rights and options that victims and survivors should receive if they are a survivor of one of those 4 crimes. Under the Clery Act, beneficially, victims or survivors should be receiving written notification of rights and options, whether the offense occurred on or off campus. It's just a matter of thinking through what information is in that written notification. Does it reflect the dynamic, holistic nature of your campus community? Does it reflect service providers on and or off campus that can target services to particular communities? And if they say that they do that, have you as an institution ever checked in to see if they actually do what they say they do? Some other things to think through as well are what systems and structures and policies do we have in place that speak to dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, and how are they described? What language is used to make sure that folks are understanding that those services are for all people, that those services are not heteronormative, that they're not only designed to help cisgender white women survivors, but any survivor, no matter gender identity, sexual orientation, race, etc. One concrete example that Sarah and I have talked through is this, and it's not a unique idea to us. I don't mean it that way. I mean it as hopefully a helpful example for all of you. But when you think about the support centers and services at your own institution, we often, unfortunately, higher education sometimes has forced marginalized communities to pick one identity that they want the most support for, and that's the organization that they strive to be a student leader in, or that's the group where they choose to do extracurricular activities, or that's the center where they try to seek out support or get a work study job or something like that. When in reality, everybody is made up of more than one identity. We are not just our race or our gender or our sexual orientation. So when we call things, a women's center or, the LGBTQ center versus a support center that is designed to be intersectional in its services, could those things be helpful? And don't get me wrong, sometimes targeted services for one identity in particular can also be extremely helpful and beneficial. But if that's the only way we provide services and support, and we don't ever try to thread or craft things together that are more literally intersectional, are we doing the best that we can to see our individuals that make up our campus community as whole people that need support for all aspects of their identity and not just one area? I'm sorry, I clicked ahead too fast. We do have a sample guide for writing or constructing your own written notification that talks about the accommodations, rights, and options that folks are afforded if they are survivors of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And that's one of the resources we provided through this year's NACSAM. So if you are interested in checking that resource out, you can always navigate to clerycenter.org/NACSAM, and our resources for the entire month are all stored there. And it's important to note, too, we won't have the time to get into the nitty-gritty of it today, but certainly the new Title IX regulations that came out earlier this year that further connect Clery and Title IX as one of the definitions of sexual harassment is dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. There is even more reason to re-examine some of the policies and procedures that you all have in place, as I'm sure you've been doing all summer anyway, because of the new regulations. And then lastly, the idea of community education. So any area where you can talk through prevention opportunities, a lot of those programs, pre-existing curriculum, are speaking from, white cis heterosexual people to white cisgender heterosexual people of a certain able-bodiedness and class. And so if we really want to think through how prevention should reach all communities, you want to use methods and language that are developed by people other than predominantly white, gender, heterosexual people. And you also want to talk through some of the risks that come up for certain communities when they decide to speak up or speak out against someone within their own community that may be doing harm to somebody else. That could take a toll on that community that really has had to already rely on itself to survive or to feel supported. And so what systems or procedures or tools or resources do you have in place at your institution if you're going to start encouraging anybody and everybody to be a proactive bystander or report crime? What happens to those individuals from certain communities on your campus when they speak out, and now they might be experiencing retaliation from other members of that community. And we can think about that as broadly as, all, student athletes, to Greek organizations, to queer students, to Black students, to our Black, queer, Greek students that are athletes, right? So we want to think through how community is such a your identities that you hold through not just who you are, but the things you choose to involve yourself with are always impacted by the actions that you take speaking up for prevention, and then also talking through the ways that you can be a good institution for those people when they have questions about what's going to happen if I speak up and out about those things. So I know that is a lot to consider and to think through. So as you are, sitting with some of this information, or it's been raising some questions or thoughts for you, we wanted to pause to give you all a chance to share in the group discussion pod, where do you think intersectionality shows up in your own Clery work the most? So that could be an experience you've already had. It could be something that you are now thinking about in light of the areas that we've brought up and asked you to think about considering. Where do you think this concept of intersectionality shows up in your Clery work the most? Take a few moments and share your thoughts in the group discussion pod. I'm going to just pause while folks are writing. So just take about 30 more seconds to share your thoughts in the group discussion chat, and as they start coming through, we'll process some of them aloud. Where do you think intersectionality shows up in your Clery work the most? Okay, I'm seeing some responses come through now. So folks are saying they've seen this in your student grievances. So I'm interpreting that to maybe mean your student conduct process cases, or your community standards cases. Is that accurate? But that is a great example of, yeah, absolutely. Okay, great, yeah. That's a great example of a time where, right, so some students might be reported more frequently than others on campus. Some students might experience inadvertent or intentional harsher sanctions, depending on the identities that they hold and how they are able to have support in those student conduct cases. Students that have more access to support services like an attorney, when you're allowed to have an advisor of your choice, they might have a different outcome than a student that does not have access to that type of support. So that's a great example there. I see another response here, training CSAs to recognize their own biases and prevent those biases from impacting their work. Recognizing the needs of individuals depending on their intersecting identities when it comes to safety. Yeah, absolutely. And so I love this part about training CSAs to recognize their own biases. So we are so focused on, making sure that CSAs report as soon as possible, that sometimes we can forget to remind them, ensure that what you are reporting is accurate, is not just an assumption that you are making of a situation or an interpretation, but more an objective, documentation of what you believe to be a crime. Absolutely. I see another response here of, I've worked with the international student and scholar population where many cultural differences are at play. So yeah, sure, like when you have international students on your campus, they are acclimating to not only the rigors of higher education, which might be different from high school or from the learning that they came from previously, but they're now also in a completely different cultural context with very limited support to other people that fully get what that transition can be like. So when you're thinking about things like language access, support services, just having somebody that they can trust, that they want to speak to when they have dealt with being perhaps the witness to or the survivor of a crime. Certainly, yeah, there are pieces around intersectionality that show up there where you want to make sure that they are getting all the services that they are owed in a way that feels the most supportive for them and sees them for who they are as people. Absolutely. Okay, so thank you so much for all of those great thoughts. That was super, super helpful, and really I think as you all sit with some of these examples and information a little bit more, you might have some more questions about ways to address some of the things that are coming up for you. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sarah, who's going to walk through a case study to kind of put this principle into practice.
Great. Thank you, Laura. I think the last response there in considering where intersectionality might show up in your Clery work came through as hate crimes and discrimination claims. And that actually is a good segue into kind of our closer look as we think about a case study. And this is directly pulled from the handbook for campus safety and security reporting. And in this example, several students called the campus security office to report swastikas spray painted on the walls in a hallway of an on-campus student housing facility. Campus security personnel investigate but cannot find conclusive evidence that the markings were bias motivated. Now today, our intent is not necessarily to make a determination on why we wouldn't classify this as a hate crime, and just so this would not be included as an incident in hate crime in your Clery Act statistics according to the handbook for campus safety and security. But really our goal in taking this little snapshot is really looking at how this might impact the community and the members of the community, and how, whether or not they feel safe, or how they might be angry or hurt or confused as to why the situation wouldn't be reflected in their campus hate crime statistics. And so as we think about that, really the takeaway here isn't related to how we classify the crime, but why it wouldn't be included in your statistics, but it's to utilize kind of a framework for applying our intersectional lens so that we can help you and and continue to help ourselves embrace the responsibility for responding to incidents such as these, instead of relying solely on our Clery statistical reporting. And so as we think about that closer look, we can identify different ways in which we might be able to apply that intersectionality lens and hopefully address some of that frustration, hurt, or distrust, or even misunderstanding that might result as a part of that. And first and foremost, you want to ensure that you're educating your campus community on the importance of reporting, so reporting all incidents that might even remotely seem bias motivated or like a hate crime, as not all members of our community might know what factors will determine hate crime reporting. And so encouraging folks to report, but then also thinking through how you can distinguish between hate crimes under the Clery Act and other bias-related incidents, and providing clarification, explaining why some incidents that are violations of institutional policy might not show up in the statistic in the annual security report. And so, this is a point where I really want to highlight that there's not only a distinction between hate crimes and bias incidents, but that also in adhering to clear requirements, doing anything proactive or responsive to an occurrence of a hate crime can sometimes get lost. And so ensuring that you're communicating with your campus community not only about hate crime documentation and response, but then also really stressing the value of specific and detailed information that might, be helpful as people build a greater understanding as to why some things are reported and why some things aren't reported. So even if an incident does not fit the formal definition of a hate crime under the Clery Act, it might still be a policy violation or a concern that can be formally addressed. Similarly, responding to these incidents with programming or actions and words should not solely come from your Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office or your CDO of Campus Inclusion and Diversity Office. It should be an institutional-wide commitment. And so really committing to inclusivity and reiterating the campus values through words and actions so that you can make it clear that you all are doing the work to dismantle hate and oppression by responding to and preventing hate incidents and violence. And then additionally, as we think about the ways in which we might be able to respond, it's important to, continue that dialogue. And, regardless of how crimes are classified, you might consider that it's more than just a number and a column. There should be an open dialogue and collaborative partnerships that are occurring on campus and also within your community, so all members of the community might feel heard and supported and welcome. And that's really, the intent in us creating this Viewing the Clery Act through an Intersectional Lens, this resource that is provided here in the files, as Laura pointed to, because it's so important for us to really consider some of the challenges as we work to implement the Clery Act requirements, but then also what we can do. Because, as we kind of go back to Kimberly Crenshaw's quote there and thinking about, now that we are familiar with intersectionality and we have an understanding of what that is, it's important for us to be able to address it. That's the good news, that intersectionality provides a way for us to see these multiple forms of exclusion and the ways in which that might impact all of the members of our campus community. And so ensuring that you all take the time to download that, to review that, and hopefully to have some of these additional conversations, not only with other Clery professionals, but professionals around your campus, as we think about all the other ways in which intersectionality might have an application, or how we can continue to make sure that that framework is the foundation as we look at some of the things that we were brought up with student grievance processes, or how we train our CSAs. That's really hopefully the intent as we start these conversations, but also as we continue those. And really, that's where we would hope that folks would do, is really trying to center that conversation. And so working to provide education to the campus community about implicit bias and where it might show up in some of these campus systems and structures and policies. So going back to the student grievance process and thinking about, students that maybe are getting written up for drug offenses or alcohol offenses, or, are you starting to see any themes or any trends there? Is there a specific group that might be, being reported more so than other groups, knowing that, oftentimes a lot of these challenges are across different populations, but really taking the time to look for some of that implicit bias that might show up not only in the ways in which we interact with folks, but also within our systems. And then also ensuring that campus and community-based service providers and programming is inclusive and accessible for all communities. So in thinking about what resources you might have on campus, is there potential to extend that to your community? If it feels as though maybe a group doesn't have the type of resources on campus, is there a group that you could partner with to bring some of those resources to the campus community so that they could utilize those? And then, the same thing in relation to that, strengthening those relationships with community-based providers to supplement some of those campus services, to really ensure that there are so many diverse voices at the table. Laura definitely highlighted that as we think through, the ways in which that we provide our prevention programming and other things, and creating those. Oftentimes there's a certain group that is identified and that is, the materials are created for and really geared for, but in doing that, we're excluding so many other identities, so many other groups and populations. And, without having those folks at the table, and without considering their voices and considering the diversity of thought, it's really difficult for us to ensure that we are meeting the needs of our campus community. We did a presentation not too long ago in response to COVID-19 and alerting and thinking about it, and one of the bullet points was truly asking members of the community what they need. And some folks were like, well, do we really need a bullet for that? And, we had to acknowledge, yes, we do, because oftentimes as we're creating these programs, as we're building these systems and creating these structures, we're not necessarily taking into account from the populations that we're intending to serve what their needs might be. And so really taking the time to center those conversations. And so this is a point where we'd like to hear from you all once again as far as what else can we do. This is really something that we strive to do, and not only providing information related to the Clery Act, but also providing the space and the opportunity for professionals like you to interact with each other, to hear from each other. Maybe there are some folks that are doing something really well, and you'd like to share that with us, and to say, hey, this is something that's worked for us, or this is something that we thought of recently that we hadn't seen before. This is really helpful to hear from others, oftentimes knowing that they're doing the same type of work, but going back to our theme, maybe in a different way, and something that you might be able to incorporate on your campus and build upon. It looks like someone here said, they'd like to see a diversity chief officer role created at their campus. And I think a lot of campuses are in that place right now, especially as we think about racial justice and the conversation related to that and some of the systemic oppression, really having someone identified on campus in that Chief Diversity Officer role, but also ensuring that once that role has been created, are you giving them the resources necessary for them to do the work that needs to be done? So is it a singular person? Do they actually have staff? Do they actually have resources? Do they have an office? Do they have a presence online? As we think about that buy-in and creating that buy-in on campus, it's important to put your money where your mouth is. If you say this is something that's important to us, also providing the resources for those individuals to do that work. Someone here said, introducing cultural fluency workshops, and even thinking about getting more support from division offices. This person said, my advocacy has often been dismissed or not taken as a priority. And I think a lot of folks may feel like they're in that place, whether that's related to Clery compliance or other compliance areas, diversity work. There are a lot of other, areas on our campuses where we may have identified them as a priority, but we haven't necessarily put the resources and the institutional buy-in and support and identified that as a value and as a priority. And so really thinking through what does that look like. And so, as you continue to have these conversations, figuring out ways that you might be able to surface some of that influence that maybe other areas might have, or some of that collaboration if y'all are sharing budgets or sharing resources, sharing human capital, really thinking about what that might look like for you all. So appreciate those comments and the suggestions, and really asking for what you'd like to see implemented on your campus, and wishing everyone the best of luck as they try and really elevate this conversation, not only as it relates to compliance, but also important issues about diversity, inclusion, accountability, and justice. And as we think about some of those different topics, we definitely want to highlight some of our NACSAM offerings that are coming up throughout the rest of the month of September. And so today, obviously, we have our intersectionality and its role in crime reporting. And our next webinar will be September 23rd. It's interpersonal violence in the age of COVID-19. And so we'll be exploring not only interpersonal violence in general on campus as it relates to dating violence and domestic violence under the Clery Act reporting crimes, but also the specific influence for COVID-19 and some of the barriers and advantages that folks experiencing interpersonal violence may find on campus. And then that's also the time where we will share our new written notification guide. So as you're thinking about creating a guide on campus for survivors of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, we'll actually walk through that guide and provide that, as many of you are thinking about providing that on campus. Then we also have webinars throughout the month that will be released. We have our first webinar that was released last week, and so essentially you can go on and listen at your own convenience. The first one is an introduction to NACSAM with our Executive Director, Jessica Mertz. And then we also have one coming up on the 16th that is a conversation about how intersectionality can inform direct services. And so as we started this conversation today related to intersectionality and crime reporting and support, also thinking about what that might look like in direct service to individuals. And we'll be speaking with staff members from NVRDC, which is our Victim Resources of DC. And then we also have a conversation with Bill Mitchell who is the author of When Dating Hurts, and that'll be coming out on September 30th. And he really goes through the story as to his experience related to losing his daughter as a result of dating violence and what he's come to learn, and then also what he has shared in his book, When Dating Hurts. And so as we think about, continuing this conversation, we definitely want to ensure that we continue to have intersectionality as a framework, but also recognizing what is happening for individuals right now during this moment in time in 2020 as we continue to do the same work in a very different way. And I know that some folks are sharing their information right now as a way to continue to have this conversation and to keep that going. And we would be happy to answer any questions that folks might want to submit either through the group discussion or through the text session. And with that, if we don't have any other questions, then we will go ahead and end for today. So thank you so much for everyone joining us. Laura, did you want to hop on and say any additional goodbyes before we wrap up today?
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Sarah. I just know that there was one question that came through about whether or not folks have permission to post the materials included in this webinar on your college's website for training purposes. So happy to answer that question more offline on an individual basis, but just wanted to draw a distinction because if that question is coming up because of the requirement through Title IX to publish materials used to train for Title IX purposes, this particular tool is not necessarily addressing Title IX concerns at all directly. And so for that, Clery Center is reserving discretion for the materials that we will provide for those purposes. So if that was the intention of asking that question, happy to talk more on offline, and I can put my email address in here to talk through that further. But beyond that, I think it's just important to also note that the intention of this resource is it's definitely good and useful information, but it's designed as a training tool for you all, for campus safety folks that are thinking through Clery Act application and requirements. So it might not as easily translate as is into a resource to put on your website to inform your campus community, because the Clery Act in general is such a nebulous, mysterious thing for the average student or staff member. So what I would encourage you to think through is how you could use the information in that resource to turn around and create something that is more directly applicable to your campus community. Like, for example, how we as an institution are thinking through intersectionality when it comes to campus safety, and these are things we are doing in order to address those things. So just something to think through there. And in general, all of our materials are copywritten, so they are not able to be copied and distributed. So if you have any other specific questions about our materials, just let me know. I'm happy to answer those for you. But I hope that addresses some of the concern that came up with that question now. Also, just to tag on to Sarah's reminders at the end, I believe that there is perhaps a survey that was already put through, a survey link. I can't remember, Cheryl, if that already came through or not, so apologies if it did not. But if it did, we would appreciate it if you took the time, there it is, perfect, to complete that feedback survey. And just truly to give us your thoughts on if the content was helpful today. And we really look forward to seeing you joining us for our other offerings. Sarah and I can hang on for a couple more minutes if folks have other questions that they'd like to ask. But otherwise, thank you to everybody that is saying thank you to us. We're glad this was helpful today.